East Germany, Albania, and Czechoslovakia. But it is equally clear that the Soviets were initially willing to accept governments friendly to them in these countries, until the West began to make threatening moves both on their ideology and their security. During this post-war period, it was the United States with its atomic monopoly, not the Soviet Union, which bears the lion's share of responsibility for starting the Cold War. The pacifist A.J. Muste wrote in 1941, "The problem after a war is with the victor. He thinks that he has just proven that war and violence pay. Who will now teach him a lesson?" Beginning with Truman's first day in office, his receptiveness to the views of hardline anti-communists, his denial of Roosevelt's understanding with Stalin, the provocative and unnecessary dropping of the atomic bombs, his spreading a network of military bases around the world, Churchill's speech at Fulton, Truman's call for fighting communism in Greece, the division and remilitarization of Germany, the continued testing of bigger and bigger atomic and hydrogen bombs, which he used to threaten the Soviet Union, Truman's deliberate exaggerations of the communist threat both overseas and at home, and his persecution and silencing of those who challenged these distortions. In all these matters, with few exceptions, the United States, after successfully liberating Western Europe, was now signaling fear and aggression. Why this fear? It has been said that as Americans we are an immigrant people to a new country, people who in one way or another have escaped persecution and poverty and fear. And those separated by two enormous oceans are still subject to that incessant fear. Even our sons and grandsons. North Americans have been taught and enamored of the myth of starting over with a new purity in a new land, the myth of American exceptionalism in a new Jerusalem, a city on the hill. Is it necessary then to exaggerate the fear of persecution from abroad, from the corrupt foreigner who would always represent the old and evil ways?
Hordes of grasping, pushing foreigners who are stealing jobs from American workmen and bread from American homes. It is to combat this peril that we, the challengers, have raised our rallying cry, America for Americans.
Are you willing to protect your job?
Well, you bet.
I'm glad to hear that, because we got a pretty bad problem here in this state. It's full of foreigners all trying to chisel jobs out of Americans like you and me.
Well, I certainly am obliged to you for telling me, Mr. Taylor. The first one of them foreigners that comes messing around my job is going to find himself in a heap of trouble.
Oh, it ain't going to be one, Metcalf. You got to fight all of them. You see, they stick together, these foreigners, and they'll knife you in the back before you even know who they are. An American alone ain't got a chance.
In the early 21st century, there would be almost 300 million guns in American homes. We are the most heavily armed nation in the world. But when any nation goes to an extreme degree to protect itself, it's inevitable that that protection will never seem psychologically to be enough. It is also often true that the image of the enemy will grow proportionate to the size of the defense, resulting in an overreaction and accelerated spending of energies in a futile attempt to liquidate that fear which never seems to erode. Fear and uncertainty are two inescapable elements in all human life since the beginning of time. They are to be accepted as one accepts birth and death. It was Alexander the Great who reportedly addressed the notion that if you can conquer your fear, you can conquer death. And in co-enduring with and containing our fear and uncertainty, we become naturally stronger. The irony of life, personal and public, is that often with the changing of time, the object of fear, the enemy, becomes, to the surprise of former enemies, a friend, often a best friend or ally. Clearly, in hindsight, U.S. leaders had exaggerated the threat from an enemy they felt they needed, wanting to frame the world as an existential clash between two antagonistic social systems. Henry Wallace, who warned that the source of all our mistakes is fear, had said it could be a healthy competition between those systems. But the hardliners of American society felt that this was impossible. and Henry Wallace was dismissed as naive. James Forrestal, one of those hardliners, the first Secretary of Defense, thus ended his life in a violent fashion that would become a strange omen for an American foreign policy that was increasingly terrified of its own shadow. 50 years into this century, halfway from 1900 to 2000, the United States had forged the foundation of a new mindset. It had developed into a full-fledged, unique kind of empire, economically supreme and massively armed, policing the world while professing liberty and democracy. For a policeman, it's necessary to locate and arrest enemies of its social system. Thus, the story of the next 60 years of American history will resemble a pattern that has already occurred in the shape of increasing covert activities unknown to the people of the empire, more and more regional wars, and a form of control that is imposed over and over again.
If history teaches us anything, it is that we must resist aggression or it will destroy our freedoms.
You are in the crosshairs of the bomb sight. An enemy is settling on you. You are a citizen of the free world, a citizen of the United States of America. You are the target.
How much time do we have?
This is the atomic age.
And with faith in the most powerful arsenal ever assembled, just 3 days before his election, the U.S. tested its first hydrogen bomb on what had been the island of Alugalab. The 65-ton device was too big to drop by plane. Alugalab burned 6 hours under a mushroom cloud, 100 miles across, and then disappeared forever. Who was this? Winston Churchill, re-elected a second time to office in 1951, had now seen 50 years of international diplomacy, from the golden age of the European empires to the horrifying rise of fascism. But this new nuclear age held a special terror for the old man. He urged Washington to seize this unprecedented opportunity and pressed for an international summit with the new Soviet leaders. He had hopes for Eisenhower. 6 weeks went by. Silence. And then Eisenhower eloquently spoke of peace.
This is not a way of life at all.
Control.
Everywhere I look around the world, the question is, what maybe we're going to lose next, you know, and we seem to be on the defensive and that they're on the offensive.
Truman wrote in his diary, World War III is here. MacArthur repeatedly and Truman separately threatened to use the bomb. General Curtis LeMay volunteered to direct the attacks, and unknown to the public, American and Soviet pilots were engaging in direct air warfare, the only extended combat between the two sides during the Cold War. The drama of Truman firing MacArthur for insubordination.
General MacArthur is one of our greatest military commanders. But the cause of world peace is much more important than any individual.
And despite some progress at the negotiations and the Soviet peace initiative after the death of Stalin, Eisenhower now threatened to widen the war. He suggested to his commanders that the Kaesong area in North Korea might be a good place to showcase America's new tactical atomic bombs. The Joint Chiefs and National Security Council endorsed atomic attacks on China. Eisenhower and Dulles made sure the communist leaders knew of these threats. Vice President Richard Nixon would later insist that Eisenhower's nuclear threats had worked brilliantly, teaching him the value of unpredictability and inspired Nixon's own madman thesis, which he applied to Vietnam less than 20 years later. Hoover often played up the phony threat of a surprise Soviet attack on the U.S. and in 1956 briefed Eisenhower on the specter of a dirty bomb unleashed in Manhattan, killing hundreds of thousands of people.
What's in the box? What's in the box?
Curiosity killed a cat, and it certainly would have you if you'd followed your impulse to open it.
Hoover was totally convinced communism was behind the black civil rights movement from World War I on, and had spied on every single black leader since. Fearing defense spending would bankrupt the country, Eisenhower and Dulles called for a new-look defense policy that would cut the size of the army and rely on cheaper nuclear weapons to be used as would other munitions, based on the assumption that any war with the Soviets would become a full-scale nuclear one. Though he had once abhorred atomic weaponry, Eisenhower told the British ambassador, "I'd rather be atomized than communized," as he set out to convince a wary public there was no difference between conventional and nuclear weapons. He told a reporter in 1955 that he considered nuclear weapons to be as available for use as other munitions. Churchill was shocked. So was Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times columnist James Reston, who wondered why not a single congressman questioned Eisenhower's commitment to sudden atomic retaliation without congressional approval. In August of '53, the Soviets exploded a 400-kiloton proto-hydrogen bomb in Kazakhstan, shocking the world. They seemed to have closed the gap and were now only 10 months behind the American H-bomb effort. In December of '54, Eisenhower ordered 42% of atomic and 36% of hydrogen bombs deployed overseas, closer to the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, he and Dulles intensified their efforts to vanquish the taboos surrounding the use of nuclear weapons. As early as December 1953, Eisenhower had unveiled his Atoms for Peace program in a speech at the UN, mesmerizing the 3,500 delegates.
If the peoples of the world are to conduct an intelligent search for peace, they must be armed with the significant facts of today's existence.
He promised energy too cheap to meter at home and abroad, ignoring scientists' warnings about the dangers of proliferation. Over the years, the administration would propose initiatives to use nuclear bombs for planetary excavation or creating harbors in Alaska, freeing inaccessible oil deposits, creating underground reservoirs, producing steam, desalinizing water. There were schemes to blast a bigger and better Panama Canal and to alter weather patterns and even melt the polar ice caps.
Hamburgers from an atomic electric skillet are tasty testimonials of things to come in the atomic age.
But when a massive hydrogen bomb test in the Marshall Islands in March of '54 went awry and contaminated islanders and Japanese fishermen, international outrage ensued.